Is that, are you getting me?
Yeah, I'm getting you.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you, Ron, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out. It's cold. It's cold out there tonight, isn't it? Thanks to Kim Bachelor also for inviting me to come and talk with you about what our state legislature got up to this year. As you probably know, the legislature here in Texas, or the Ledge, as many of us call it, only meets every 2 years. 2017 was one of those years. This year we had the usual regular session, January through May, and there was some sort of critical unfinished business at the end of the regular session, and so Governor Abbott called the Ledge back for a 30-day special session in August. Now, as Ron was very kindly mentioned, besides my work as a scholar, I'm a non-resident scholar in religion and politics with the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, and as an adjunct professor at at Brite and SMU, and also TCU, where I'm teaching this year. I also write as a freelancer for the Texas Observer, which has been covering Texas politics for over 60 years. And I'm going to draw much of my talk this evening from reporting that my Observer colleagues and I did during the regular and special sessions. Now, when Kim asked me to come up with a sexy title for this talk, the best I could come up with was Legislating Injustice. I'm not sure that gets very high on the sexy bar, but this year's Ledge has been called a lot worse than Legislating Injustice. One of my Observer colleagues called the regular session the worst legislature ever. And the 30-day special session picked up its own share of nicknames. 30 Days of Horror, the Special Discrimination Session, and the Session of Oppression. I called it, in an article that came out in August, I called it the Dominionism Special. I don't know if any of you saw that article. And I called it that because of the predominance of major bills furthering the agenda of dominionists, those who seek conservative Christian dominance or dominion over government. And we talk more about that. It's not actually part of my talk, but if you're interested, I'll be glad to talk more about that during the Q&A. So anyway, maybe you get the general picture. The Ledge got up to a whole lot of mischief this year, and it passed several pieces of legislation that, at least from a social justice perspective, were pretty awful. So this is what I'm going to talk about tonight. Before we look at specific bills, I'm going to try to give you some context, what I think is important anyway, about the context, the very different dynamics at work in the Texas Senate versus the Texas House. And then I'm going to cover a few of the measures that I think are of greatest interest to social justice-minded people of faith. And so, as not to completely bum you out, I'm going to cover the bad news first. And the bad news includes bills relating to abortion, sanctuary cities, and religious refusal. But there's also some good news. There were some very bad bills, at least from my perspective, that didn't pass, never got all the way to the governor's desk. And those include the highly discriminatory bathroom bill and a dangerous school voucher scheme. And then finally, I'm going to offer a few thoughts about what lies ahead and what social justice-minded people of faith might do about it. So, first, some context. Now, you don't need me to tell you that Republicans pretty much run Texas, right? They hold all the statewide offices and have substantial majorities in both chambers of the legislature. And the Texas GOP is even more radically right-wing than the national Republican Party. The Texas Republican Party was once dominated by business interests, by the business lobby. It's now dominated by extreme libertarians and the religious right. And social justice concerns play little or no role in their calculations. But I'm going to have more to say about that in a moment. Now, I know that many progressives, especially those outside of Texas, regard the Texas GOP as little more than a bunch of Neanderthals, right? And really, I can't blame them for having that impression. For example, take President Trump's approval ratings. While his approval ratings have dipped to record-breaking lows nationally, around 33% in August, he remains wildly popular among Texas Republicans. And in October, 79% of Texas Republicans approved of Trump's performance in office. And even the handful of comparatively liberal Republicans in Texas really aren't all that liberal. For instance, Houston Representative Sarah Davis is pro-choice and pro-LGBT. But she also sponsored a bill prohibiting government entities from deducting union dues from employee paychecks. Now, however, a closer look at the closer look shows that the Texas GOP is more complicated than just a kind of uniform Neanderthalness, or whatever you want to call it. Now, in Texas, a bill can only become law if the governor signs it, and it can only get to the governor's desk if the identical bill is passed by both houses, by the Senate and the House. And if you followed the legislature at all this year, you probably noticed that the Senate and the House seemed to be playing by different rules, even though both are heavily dominated by Republicans. Bills passed by wide margins in the Senate got bottled up in the House, and vice versa. And what we saw, really, were two sides of the Texas Republican Party at war with each other. The Senate is very much Dan Patrick's operation. As Lieutenant Governor, Patrick serves as president of the Senate. He can, as far as I know, he can't actually author any bills himself, at least in his own name, but he does appoint committee chairs and can vote to break a tie in the unusual circumstances that there would be a tie in the Senate. Patrick is a white evangelical conservative Republican. It's emblematic of the folks who voted for Trump. He's a straight-up culture warrior, anti-abortion, anti-LGBT, anti-public education, anti-immigrant. He came to state politics after a career as a Rush Limbaugh-style radio talk show host. And unlike traditional conservative Republicans, Patrick also has shown that he's willing to throw Texas business interests under the bus if they conflict with his religious right social agenda. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, the Senate has 20 Republicans and 11 Democrats. Under Patrick, the Senate lowered the threshold by which a bill could come to the floor for a vote. Okay? In the past, it took a 2/3 majority, 21 votes, to bring a bill to the floor. Okay? And that meant that any bill could not be considered without at least one Democratic vote. Okay? Under Patrick's 3/5 rule, it took only 18 votes to bring a bill to the floor, meaning that the Democrats could stop bills only through filibuster. That's the only mechanism they had. And most GOP senators stayed in lockstep with Patrick throughout both the regular and the special sessions. Now, in the House, it's a very different story. There's, again, a decisive GOP majority, 95 Republican representatives versus 55 Democratic, and that means that any bill, as in the Senate, any bill can pass on GOP votes alone. But the Speaker, Joe Strauss of San Antonio, is elected by all the representatives, and he, in the last session, previous session, put together a coalition of Democrats and moderate Republicans in order to get the speakership. Now, by more moderate Republicans, I mean by comparison to, say, the Tea Party or religious right conservatives like Patrick. But basically, Strauss and his lieutenants, the representatives that are allies of his, that usually are committee chairs, that sort of thing, Byron Cook, for example, Strauss and his lieutenants are basically pro-business conservatives, And among them are some legislators that I've come to respect and even admire, some of whom do display a concern for social justice. I've already mentioned pro-choice and pro-LGBT Sarah Davis of Houston. This year I also had the opportunity to watch House Public Education Chair Dan Huberty of Humboldt. He attempted to push through a school finance reform bill, which had a lot of flaws and so forth, but and also his efforts were eventually blocked by the Senate. But I had the impression watching Huberty that he really does genuinely care about Texas school kids and Texas parents. And in the 2013 legislative sessions, J.D. Sheffield of Gatesville supported a taxpayer-funded school breakfast program and sponsored a bill allowing pregnant minors or minor parents, that is, parents who are minors, to consent to their own immunization without parental consent. There was a kind of a block there where minors had to get parental consent in order to get immunized. Anyway, so that went through, passed. And Joe Strauss himself strikes me as a basically decent, thoughtful legislator. For instance, he told the New Yorker that he opposed the bathroom bill, which I'm going to discuss in a minute, because he said, quote, "I don't want the suicide of a single Texan on my hands." And by the way, Strauss is Jewish, which opened him up to a fusillade of anti-Semitic assaults on social media, complete with swastikas and other Nazi imagery. And some state Republicans said they would prefer a Christian hold the Speaker's office. Generally then, the Strauss faction in the House may be more conservative than most Democrats, but they're not interested in the slash and burn culture wars that drive Lieutenant Governor Patrick and his Senate allies. So as a result, more radical conservatives have slammed Strauss and his lieutenants as liberals, which they're not, or rhinos. They know that. Republicans in name only, right? Now, like Patrick, Strauss appoints committee chairs, and they can bottle up legislation they don't like. Now, there is a House Freedom Caucus, whose members hold a kind of odd mixture of extreme libertarianism and religious right ideology, but it only has 12 members, and that's not enough to really control the House at this point. So, Strauss and his lieutenants were able to block some of the more radical Senate measures, generally because they saw them as bad for Texas business, but in some cases out of social justice concerns. Okay, so that's the kind of the context for what we're looking at tonight. Now, a boatload of bad legislation did make it into law this year, and I'm going to highlight 3 new laws that should be of special interest to social justice-oriented people of faith: the Texas Omnibus Abortion Bill, the Sanctuary Cities Ban, and the Religious Refusal Bill affecting adoption agencies. So here they are. First, the Texas Omnibus Abortion Bill, Senate Bill 8, SB 8. I know that people, including many social justice-minded people of faith, disagree strongly over the morality of abortion. So maybe folks in this room do as well. For some, protecting the life in the womb is itself a matter of social justice. Protecting the innocent, right? So there's that point of view. I do understand that position, but for me, protecting a woman's right to an abortion, protecting abortion access, is itself also a social justice issue. And let me just explain why I think so. I'll give you 3 reasons that I rely on. First, that the access to an abortion goes directly to the question of a woman's ability to control her own body and make her own choices. And that question becomes particularly critical in cases of rape or incest, or where the pregnancy endangers the woman's health or life. Second, restrictions on abortion access disproportionately affect poor women, since women with financial means will be able to travel to other states where abortion is more easily accessed. My third reason involves fetal personhood. When does a fetus become a person with rights that trump the rights of the mother? The fact that people of faith disagree over that question, that have different answers to that question, means that when government privileges one moral perspective on abortion, for example, personhood begins at conception, it necessarily discriminates against those who have different beliefs and arguably runs counter to our long tradition of church-state separation. So we have other, just to step back a little bit, we have certain traditions, Judaism, for example, which considers fetal personhood to really to occur at birth. Okay, so fetal personhood is pushed pretty far out in pregnancy. Muslims tend to regard the fetus as a person around the beginning of the second trimester, for example. So in the first trimester, traditionally, it's been abortion has been permitted. Many Christian groups have not really ruled on the question of, have not come to a common sort of doctrine of fetal personhood, but they have, many of the mainline Protestant groups have come out in support of abortion access, okay, while recognizing life begins at conception. So they've tried to balance these two. But basically, you have some religious positions, religious communities who believe that personhood begins at conception, and other religious folks do not. They push personhood further out. So decisions about abortion, laws about abortion, cut across those different religious beliefs. In other words, I'll have an example of that in a moment. Okay, back to the Texas Omnibus Abortion Bill, SB8. Let me set the stage to talk about this bill by giving you some background. Back in 2013, and you may remember this, the Leg passed the far-reaching HB 2, House Bill 2, which had the effect of sharply restricting abortion access by requiring abortion facilities to meet hospital standards and requiring doctors performing abortions to have hospital admitting privileges. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down that law in 2016, but in the meantime, over half of the abortion clinics in Texas, 21 out of 40, were forced to close. Now, the court decision overturning HB 2 was a setback for the religious right in Texas, but they kept up their efforts to restrict abortion in the 2017 Leg. The Texas Omnibus Abortion Bill regulates the disposal of fetal remains and bans one of the most common types of abortion in the second trimester. And both provisions, I argue, are problematic. As I wrote in November of last year, the fetal remains provision requires hospitals and abortion clinics to bury or cremate all fetal remains, no matter the period of gestation. All right, so even really early in the pregnancy, where you have a fetus or embryo, I'm not sure what the term is, that may be the size of a seed or the end of your finger or something like that. It doesn't matter. It has to be buried or cremated. That's controversial and likely unconstitutional because it assumes the essentially religious belief that an embryo or fetus from the moment of conception is a person with the same right to life as you and me. While Roman Catholics and Baptists believe that, Jews and Muslims, as well as some Christian groups, as I said before, do not recognize fetal personhood until later in a pregnancy. And indeed, Reform Rabbi Ralph Mecklenburger, maybe some of you know him, he's I guess the Rabbi Emeritus now at Bethel Synagogue in Fort Worth. Mecklenburger told me that he suspects that proponents of the fetal remains provision are simply trying to drive up the cost of therapeutic abortion as a means of forcing their values on others. That's what Ralph said. Now, a federal judge blocked that provision last year when it was initially rolled out as a regulation. Now, SB 8 also makes it a felony to perform a dilation and evacuation abortion, or D&E. That's, I understand, a very common procedure in the second trimester. However, the courts have also put that provision on hold. As the Observer's Sophie Novak reported, Federal District Judge Lee Yackel ruled that the ban on D&E constituted an undue burden to women seeking abortions. Banning D&E abortions, Yackel wrote in his ruling, quote, would cause women to suffer irreparable harm by being unable to access the most commonly used and safest abortion procedure during the second trimester. Yackel also wrote that the ban would force women and doctors to use alternative methods that were, quote, more complex, risky, expensive, difficult for many women to arrange, and often involve multi-day visits to physicians and overnight hospital stays, end quote. And that's Yackel. By the way, Sophie Novak, the Observer reporter, also notes that courts have already blocked similar D&E abortion bans in 5 other states. Okay, so blocking this is consistent with federal court rulings for the moment. So the bottom line here is that the Ledge once again moved to restrict abortion access, but that move has been blocked by the federal courts, at least for the moment. Okay, now the second bit of what I'm calling bad news is the Sanctuary Cities ban, SB 4. And like SB 8, it also landed Texas in federal court before it could take effect. Wikipedia, what's a sanctuary city, right? That's a kind of unknown. But Wikipedia, that ever-reliable reference site, defines sanctuary city as one that limits its cooperation with the national government effort to enforce immigration laws. So that's how Wikipedia defines it. And I think that's a pretty good definition. Officials in sanctuary cities do not go out of their way to seek out undocumented persons and turn them over to ICE. Now, SB 4, the Sanctuary Cities ban, aims to ban sanctuary cities and punish local officials who materially limit, whatever that means, immigration enforcement. Like abortion, the question of undocumented immigrants is a fraught issue from a social justice perspective. On the one hand, many of the undocumented provide businesses with a pool of cheap labor that can be exploited. And their labor has been a real boon to business and government over the past few decades. Indeed, my Texas Observer colleague Chris Hooks argues that the so-called Texas miracle of the 1990s and 2000s was produced largely on the backs of the undocumented. And during that period, the Republican Party, which was then dominated by the business lobby, took a largely laissez-faire approach to this issue of undocumented workers. But even if you don't like the way the undocumented have been exploited, deporting them or driving them into the shadows doesn't seem very just either. However, that's pretty much the position the state GOP has taken since around 2014, largely thanks to Lieutenant Governor Patrick. Patrick ran for lieutenant governor on promises of, quote, securing the border, quote, and he hammered opponents he accused of being soft on illegal aliens. In this respect, he foreshadowed the rise of Trump. The same year, the state GOP stripped out a guest worker plank that had been in the state GOP platform. Now, Governor Abbott picked up on this trend, sort of anti-undocumented trend, and earlier this year began threatening Travis County Sheriff Sally Hernandez, maybe you've heard about that, she's a Democrat, for what Abbott claimed was offering sanctuary to dangerous criminals. And by the way, Sheriff Hernandez had no such policy, and PolitiFact Texas found Abbott's claim to be, as they said, incorrect and ridiculous. The culmination of this move away from the old business lobby-oriented look-the-other-way approach came this year in SB 4. As the Observer reported, not only does SB 4 threaten to jail elected officials who limit cooperation with federal immigration agents, its show me your papers provision allows police to question the immigration status of anyone being detained, not just arrested. Okay? And once again, however, at least parts of the measure were quickly stopped by a federal judge, or put on hold by a federal judge. As the Observer's Gus Bova wrote, Federal District Judge Orlando Garcia slammed the brakes on much of Texas sanctuary cities ban. In his ruling granting a preliminary injunction, Garcia blocked provisions that would have made immigration detainers mandatory, let untrained police act as immigration agents, and barred local officials from criticizing cooperation between police and immigration agents, end quote. Unfortunately, however, Garcia did not block the law's controversial show me your papers provision, which critics have said will lead to racial profiling. That measure will force law enforcement leaders to allow cops to ask about immigration status during routine detentions for anything from speeding to jaywalking. And that controversial provision does remain in force, at least for the moment, and localities are having to adapt their policies to it. Okay, the final bill that I'll discuss under bad news is HB 3859. House Bill 3859 is relating to protection of the rights of conscience for child welfare services providers. This is another in a succession of so-called religious freedom measures, or religious liberty measures sometimes called, that have cropped up across the country since the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in the Obergefell ruling. These bills aim to shield various agents, government officials, business owners, contractors, etc., who discriminate against LGBT people based on sincerely held religious beliefs. Now, while several such bills were filed in the Texas Leg this year, only one made it into law, and this is HB 3859, which covers child welfare agencies, including adoption and foster care placement organizations. At least to my mind, it's rather deceptively titled the Freedom to Serve Children Act. In fact, as the Observer reported, it prohibits the state from taking any adverse actions against child welfare providers who discriminate on religious grounds. Child welfare providers acting on sincerely held religious beliefs can refuse to place children with same-sex or non-Christian foster or adoptive parents under this law. So to take a hypothetical, and let's say an evangelical Christian child welfare organization could refuse on religious grounds to place a Muslim child with Muslim foster parents. Now, furthermore, critics say the law will also give foster parents and organizations license to refuse vaccines, deny contraception, or send children to anti-LGBT conversion therapy. In an open letter to lawmakers, 9 Texas law professors, including 3 from SMU's law school, called HB 3859, quote, misguided and unconstitutional, end quote. The law is not only a solution in search of a problem, they wrote, it creates substantial constitutional problems insofar as it reaches too broadly in an effort to protect religious liberty. And those concerns were echoed by civil rights groups across the country, including the ACLU, Human Rights Campaign, and Lambda Legal. They all say the law violates the First Amendment prohibition of state-sponsored religion, also known as the Establishment Clause. Now, civil rights groups are already planning legal action to stop the law. The Observer reports that civil rights groups say they will be contacting foster and adoptive children and families about the law so they can report any discrimination, and a lawsuit against Texas will likely be filed once a potential plaintiff's rights have been violated. And as far as I know, no legal action has been taken yet, but stay tuned. Okay, that's a lot of bad news. Fortunately, the news out of Austin wasn't all bad this year. Some particularly egregious legislation didn't make it to the governor's desk, and that includes one measure that received a lot of media coverage, the bathroom bill, and a measure that the media mostly ignored, a school voucher bill. Both were pet projects of Lieutenant Governor Patrick. So first, the bathroom bill. Patrick seems to have staked his political career on fighting LGBT equality. It's been kind of a major crusade for him over the last few years. He counts among his longtime associates and supporters Dr. Stephen Hotze, a virulently anti-gay Houston doctor, and the anti-LGBT Texas Pastors Council, which is also centered in the Houston area. In 2015, Patrick fought successfully against Houston's HERO ordinance. If any of you remember that fight at all. The HERO ordinance would have broadened anti-discrimination coverage for Houston's LGBT population. Patrick characterized his opposition as fighting to, quote, keep men out of ladies' rooms, end quote. That's a slogan he's continued using ever since. After HERO went down to defeat at the polls, Patrick carried the fight statewide, most prominently in the bathroom bill. And he called on his Republican colleague, State Senator Lois Colkhorst of Brenham, to carry the bill in the 2017 ledge. SB 6 was entitled the Texas Privacy Act, and it would regulate bathroom use in government buildings, public schools, and universities based on biological sex, keeping transgender Texans from using bathrooms that match their gender identities. The measure would also prohibit local governments from adopting or enforcing local bathroom regulations, as I think Dallas has done, Fort Worth ISD did, and so forth. So there have been several of these local governments that have already set up their own regulations. The bathroom bill would have prohibited that from happening. Hundreds of individuals testified against the bill in Senate hearings, but it still passed the Senate largely along party lines. In the House, however, and this is why I talked about the different dynamics earlier on, in the House, it was a very different story. House Speaker Joe Strauss and his lieutenants were listening to vigorous opposition to the bill from the business community. A whole host of corporations came out against the bill, including Amazon, Apple, Dell, Microsoft, Intel, Capital One, Ben & Jerry's, Facebook, American Airlines, Southwest Airlines, and United Airlines. IBM, which has 10,000 employees in Texas, was especially active in the effort to defeat the bathroom bill. It placed a full-page ad against the measure in major Texas newspapers. And by the way, the law enforcement community in Texas also came out against the bill. Speaker Strauss in the Texas House declared that a bathroom bill was not a priority for the House. And this was also probably a personal matter for Strauss. I mentioned earlier his comment about not wanting the suicide of a single Texan on his hands. Now the House did pass a far less sweeping bathroom measure. Like the Senate measure, it too would have required schools to restrict bathroom use according to biological sex, as they call it in the law. But unlike the Senate measure, it would have allowed transgender students to access single stall restrooms, locker rooms, and changing facilities at their schools. So it was kind of a compromise, in other words, attempted compromise. But apparently that compromise was too moderate for Patrick's Senate, and the Senate rejected it. As the regular session drew to a close with no movement on the bathroom bill, Patrick resorted to coercion. He essentially forced the governor to call a special session by holding hostage a must-pass sunset bill, which reauthorized 5 important state agencies, including the Texas Medical Board, which licenses and regulates doctors. So in effect, Patrick said that if he didn't get his bathroom bill, he would not allow the sunset bill to be considered, and thus forced a special session. Now, the bathroom bill apparently was not the priority for Governor Abbott that it is for Lieutenant Governor Patrick, but really Abbott had no choice but to call a special session to address the must-pass sunset bill. And also there was suspicion that Abbott was also worried about Lieutenant Governor Patrick challenging him for governor in the 2018 primaries. So Abbott also added privacy, meaning the bathroom bill, to the list of measures the legislature had to address in the special session. Well, long story short, the Senate once again passed the bathroom bill, but it never made it out of committee in the House. And so when the special adjourned, the bathroom bill was dead. Now, the same fate awaited another of Patrick's pet measures, a school voucher bill. As I wrote in the Observer, Patrick has long championed school choice as a solution to what he claims are failing public schools, but his previous efforts to institute vouchers came to naught. And Texas has resisted successfully various Republican voucher schemes proposed over the years. However, in this year's special session, Patrick tried, so to speak, to get the camel's nose under the tent, okay, with a very limited voucher bill. And this was Senate Bill 2, which passed the Senate in the opening days of the special session. And this bill would have given 6,000 special needs students state-sponsored scholarships to pay tuition for private or religious schools. As with the bathroom bill, there was widespread opposition to Patrick's voucher scheme. Critics argued that if passed, SB 2 would make it easier for future legislatures to expand vouchers to other situations. In 8 hours of testimony, parents, educators, and activists told a Senate panel that subsidizing private school tuition for students with disabilities would sap resources from public schools. As with the bathroom bill, however, the measure failed to pass the House, where support for public education remained strong under the leadership of one of those Strauss lieutenants I mentioned earlier, Dan Huberty of Humboldt, who was the House Public Education Chair. So the good news is that two, from my perspective, really awful pieces of legislation went down in flames despite having the backing of very powerful Republicans. And that's thanks in part to lots of citizens speaking out against them, but it's also thanks to opposite business lobby and from moderate Republicans in the Texas House. So, what's next? And sadly, that good news I gave you before is just about the last bit of good news that I'll have for you in these remarks. It's not quite the last, but almost. I'd really like to leave you with a rosy scenario, but things here in Texas have been tough for Rosie for a long time. There's a slim, the pundits seem to be of two minds about how likely that would be. Maybe after the state GOP primaries and before the midterm elections. Maybe, maybe not. If he doesn't, if Abbott doesn't call a special session next year, then the Ledge will next meet in 2019. And in 2019, Speaker Strauss won't be around to serve as a firewall against more extreme GOP legislation, as he has been. Strauss announced in October that he will not run for re-election to the House in 2018, and so did one of his top lieutenants, Representative Byron Cook of Corsicana. My Baker Institute colleague, political scientist Mark Jones, called the Strauss retirement an earth-shattering event. I think he's right. Jones wrote, to the extent that Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Governor Abbott both want to see substantially more conservative legislation, like a bathroom bill or school choice items, we're going to see that legislation fly through in 2019 because the centrist break that was there in legislatures in past sessions, Joe Strauss, is no longer going to be there. And it looks also like the Texas GOP is undergoing a kind of purge right now, a process of purging more moderate Republicans. Governor Abbott recently took the unusual step, what the Observer's Chris Hooks called a fatwa of sorts, of calling for the replacement of moderate pro-choice Republican House member Sarah Davis. Abbott's backing her primary challenger in the Republican Party. And it's an odd move, at least from one point of view, because Davis managed to win as a Republican in a district that went for Hillary by 15 points in 2016. So a more conservative Republican candidate probably wouldn't win that seat. But as Hooks writes, House Speaker Strauss's retirement gives more hard-right Republicans like Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick the opportunity to try to force conformity on the House. Because the Republicans are in no real danger of losing their overall House majority anytime soon, Hooks writes, it's better for Abbott and friends to have a smaller, purer GOP caucus. Consequently, Republican primary fights between moderates and conservatives will be especially vicious this year, Hook says. So you might watch for more assaults on relatively moderate Republican House members in the run-up to the 2018 primary elections. And that brings me to 2018, next year's critical midterm election. And it's a big one. It's a big one. Besides Ted Cruz's U.S. Senate seat, all the U.S. House seats, and all state House seats, Texans will pick most statewide offices, including governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, court of public accounts, land office commissioner, and agriculture commissioner. And 15 state Senate seats will also be up for grabs. Now you'd think that, given the continuing embarrassment that is Donald Trump, 2018 would be a particularly promising year for Democratic candidates. We're hearing talk of turning Texas blue. And in my more ecstatic moments, I've used that phrase myself. And the demographics are definitely on the side of the Democrats. Now, that's the final piece of good news that I was talking about earlier, that I promised earlier. By 2023, 6 years from now, the growing Hispanic population is forecast to overtake the declining and, in some cases, aging non-Hispanic population. The exception to that is the Asian American population, which tends to be young. If Hispanics remain loyal to the Democratic Party, and if their voter turnout rates improve, that's nothing but good news for the Democrats. In the near term, however, I remain skeptical about the possibility of Texas turning blue or even purple. Democrats have not won a statewide race in Texas for 20 years, and the Texas Democratic Party is weak and not well organized. As Chris Hooks noted recently, in huge swaths of Texas, there simply is no Democratic Party to speak of. The local infrastructure doesn't exist. Particularly in rural areas, local elections may feature no Democrats at all, and decades may have passed since the last competitive race outside of the Republican primary. And former San Antonio mayor and former U.S. Housing Secretary Julian Castro admitted in early November of this year that it's been, he said it was a tough cycle to recruit Democratic candidates. Democrat Beto O'Rourke, of course, is challenging Ted Cruz for the U.S. Senate. Lieutenant Governor Patrick faces a challenge from Democrat Mike Collier. But there's little clarity about what Democrats may run for other statewide offices. At the time that I wrote these remarks, Andrew White had not yet entered the race. He just did today. And Lupe Valdez was also not, the Dallas County Sheriff, had also not made up her mind yet. At the time I wrote this, of course, she announced yesterday. So we now have two kind of bigger name, Democratic candidates in the race for governor. Lupe Valdez, I think has I think can give Abbott a run for his money if she makes it through the Democratic primary. Andrew White, I don't know much about him. I do know that there have been some voices in the Texas Democratic Party who consider him to be too conservative, and Wendy Davis has called him anti-choice. So he may have a kind of hard road hoe. I don't know. But anyway, we do have those folks running for governor now. The biggest problem for Democrats, though, remains turnout. Even in last year's presidential election, total eligible voter turnout, and that's total, not just Democrats, was only 46% in the presidential election. And even in an election that featured the Republican presidential candidates saying some really nasty things about Hispanics, turnout among Texas Hispanics eligible to vote was only 40.5%. 40.5%. It was up slightly from 2012, but still very low. And by comparison, turnout among eligible whites was 60%. Okay. So, what are social justice-oriented people of faith to do? I wish I had some profound answers to give you, but I don't. I'm a scholar and sometimes journalist. I'm not even really much of an activist, and certainly not a politician. You should be able to tell that from my speaking tonight. But a few things do come to mind. First, if you can run for local office, do it. If you can't run, get involved in local campaigns. The Democratic Party badly needs to deepen its bench. It needs social justice-minded people on city councils, local school boards, county commissions, and other local offices. Those are, so to speak, the farm teams in which talent for state office can be cultivated. Republicans figured that out a long time ago, and that's part of the reason for their dominance in the state. A second thought is that we really, this is not going to be news to anybody, but we need to work on the turnout problem in Texas, especially in traditionally low turnout years like midterm elections, off-year elections, like 2018. Texas won't change unless more Texans start taking ownership of the some people of faith may need, beyond the weak Texas Democratic Party, and seek out allies among moderate Republicans like Strauss or Davis. As the Texas GOP purges its more moderate voices and moves further to the right, we might be able to find ways to work with these Republican moderates on an issue-by-issue basis. We may disagree with them on taxes or regulations or guns or even abortion for that matter, but we might find common ground on bathrooms, on school vouchers, on other items. So those are my remarks for this evening. So